And then it started to warm up. And that warming, solar driven, started about 1850, and it warmed up to about 1890. Then it cooled a little bit until about 1908. Then it started to warm up to 1940. And in fact, during that warm period in the 20s and the 30s, the polar route from the Atlantic to the Pacific was used. And that was used by the Russians, it was used by the German military in the Second World War. Surprise, suddenly there's a German battleship in the North Pacific. It had come across the polar route. We know from sea surface temperatures that were measured then, and we know from the ice distribution, it was much, much warmer. And then it started to cool. And it started to cool until 1976. And in 1976, there was an extraordinary event recorded. The oceanographers told us that the wave action had changed, the fishing fields had moved, and the physicists, God bless them, told us that the length of the day had changed. And the only way you can change the length of the day is to change the Earth's orbit. And all of a sudden, we started warming from 1976 until a great El Nino event in 1998. And then we've had moderately static global temperatures, and since 2002, the 4 major temperature measuring stations in the world have been recording global cooling. So here we've got in geological time a lack of relationship between temperature and carbon dioxide. And in the last decade, we've got carbon dioxide increasing, yet temperature is decreasing. Again, a disconnect. So where does that carbon dioxide come from? Well, of course, it comes from industry. Well, does it? Because Russian work on the ice sheets in Antarctica shows that when we've had warming, 800 years later, we get an increase in carbon dioxide. What happened 800 years ago? The medieval warming. So there's an enormous amount that we do not know that drives climate. And what heartens me is that the biggest climate change we've ever had on planet Earth was when we had just a slight temperature change and just a slight sea level change. And this was in a period of time we call the Neo-Proterozoic. This was when we had ice at the equator, at sea level, and the planet was a snowball. How did we get out of it? We don't know. How did we get into it? We don't know. We didn't have a continental shelf, we just had continents and the deep oceans. So we had at least a 600-metre sea level change. And then it suddenly ended. We had sea level rise, the sea surface temperature went to 40 degrees Celsius, massive algal reefs started to pull out carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and we had very warm oceans, far warmer than anything we see today. And that was absolutely magnificent. And then we went back into a cold period and sea level dropped again. Sea level probably dropped at least 800 metres, maybe 1,500 metres. And it was excessively cold. We had ice at the equator and ice at sea level, and then sea level rose again. And all the nutrients got washed into the ocean, and those nutrients kick-started a great leap in life. Now that was the greatest climate change we've ever seen on planet Earth. And we don't know why. So if we can't explain the biggest climate changes in the past, or if we ignore the past, we do so at our peril. I argue that the modern movement, frightening us witless about climate change, is an urban, atheistic, fundamentalist religion with no contact with the environment. Their information comes from blog sites, which are of course refereed and highly reliable. Their information comes from a television screen. They don't live in rural areas where you can talk to your grandfather about the previous weather, where you've got 130 years of rainfall record. These urban, fundamentalist, religious folk have no knowledge of the past, no knowledge of history or archaeology or geology, where we see that there have been massive changes. And I argue that the current movement is replacing failed Western socialism and failed Western Christianity, and people are asking a really fundamental question. Where do we come from? What are we doing here? And where are we going? And they need some purpose in life. They have to believe in something. And to believe in an environmental matter is wonderful, because you don't really have to commit. You've got no great scholarship that's involved. You pay your indulgences. You've got your Holy Writ, which is the IPCC documents. You've got your leaders like Al Gore, who's frightening you witless. And it's a very, very good way of actually keeping a society controlled by having them frightened. And what a wonderful thing to be frightened of. Carbon dioxide. You can't taste it. You can't smell it. You can't see it. And if you forget what you were taught at school, you forget that it is plant food. It is the very essence of life. Now, to talk in public about carbon pollution is a wonderful advertisement of your total ignorance of basic science. Now, to make matters worse, carbon is black. If we had carbon pollution, you'd be walking into lampposts because you couldn't see where you're going. So that, to me, is the ultimate of spin. And for me, the tragedy is that we've had organisations such as the ABC, God bless them, universities, CSIRO and government departments captured where there is very little independent advice now being given. And I find that we are in really interesting times where we have this urban, atheistic, fundamentalist religion where you can ignore any contrary advice. People like me get demonised. Well, I don't need that. I've got a wife to do that. Demonising of dissent. Anyone with a contrary view is either clinically unbalanced or is given no oxygen. And we had this marvellous situation on the ABC Science Show where they gave my book a thorough thrashing by the only experts they could drag up. And this thorough thrashing was not a book review, it was basically a repetition of the mantra. It's very much a religious process. And to make it even more exciting is dear Robin Williams, and I've done many programs with him. I've been communicating with him while he's having his wonderful holiday in Italy. No way in the world would he let me onto the science show. And that book is a book of science. It's a book with 2,311 footnotes. This is the major scientific journals that I've looked at. It is a book written for the punter. It is a book that doesn't pull the atmosphere out of the whole Earth system. And the Earth system is what's happening in the galaxy, what's happening in the sun, what's happening in the atmosphere, what's happening in the oceans, what's happening in the Earth, and what's happening in the ice. The climatologists have pulled the atmosphere out of that and they've tortured it with their computer models until it has confessed to something that it hasn't done. And this is the level of our scientific debate at present. So when we look at this wonderful element carbon, it is the essence of life. When we look at where carbon is in the surface of the Earth, there is some in the atmosphere, and then we've got soils, and we've got life, and then we've got rocks, and then we've got what's beneath our feet. In the top 4 kilometres of the crust and all the atmosphere, the bulk of the carbon is held in rocks, and that has been sequestered out of the atmosphere. It was once in the atmosphere. And when we had an atmosphere of 20 or 30% carbon dioxide compared with our 0.0385%, we had no tipping points. We had no runaway greenhouse. We didn't die. We thrived. So the bulk of the surface carbon on the planet is actually sitting in rocks. The whole process is driven by natural cycles, and one of the big cycles we don't understand is the biomass beneath our feet. The greatest biomass on Earth, it's not trees, so don't cuddle them. It's not whales, it's actually bacteria. But they don't sell good stories. And the bacteria beneath our feet pump out huge amounts of gases into the atmosphere. The main greenhouse gas in the atmosphere isn't carbon dioxide, it is water vapour. And you really can't have a fatwa on water vapour. But carbon dioxide, you can say this comes from industry. So I think we are in a very interesting growth period in society where we are able to use this gas, this plant food carbon dioxide, we are able to demonise it. We're able to say it comes from industry, it comes from you wealthy people. I spent a lot of my life travelling in third world countries. You try to talk to someone in a third world country about climate change. They haven't got a clue what you're talking about. They're concerned about their next meal. They're concerned about potable water and electricity. They have no concern at all about climate change. So I look through the information that we get from the past using that glorious four-letter word time. And in our lifetime, our 70 years, we've had changes in climate, unrelated to carbon dioxide. If we look in archaeological time, we've had changes unrelated to carbon dioxide. And if we look in geological time, we've had changes unrelated to carbon dioxide. And my fear is that the current modern, urban, atheistic religion of embracing climate change is going to give religion a bad name. Thank you.